Welcome. Thanks for cozying up and challenging your usual sense of personal space. Much nicer than if we had to put people over in the other room and watch it on TV. So my name is Steve Manel. I'm the director of Dalhousie's College of Sustainability, and we are your hosts tonight. This lecture is being presented as part of the College of Sustainability's Environment, Sustainability, and Society lecture series. This is a series that occurs every Thursday evening at this time, where we bring in speakers from various parts of the world and various perspectives to present different perspectives on sustainability and sustainable solutions. And we really enjoy it when we can partner with other folks, and there's a long list of people that we partner with tonight for this lecture, and it's a real pleasure to see such a diverse crowd out. For those of you who don't normally come to this Thursday evening lecture, one of the things that I'll share with you is that you're actually in a classroom tonight. This is also the first year and second year sustainability class, and all those students are here in the audience. So this is Dalhousie's gesture back to the world that we want to bring people in to share learning with students, not see it as learning and public lectures as two separate things, but these are places where we can actually all learn together. And hopefully in the question period we'll get to learn a little bit from one another, from the perspectives of students and from the perspectives of members of the community. So two things I want to mark before we move on, and I'll introduce Gordon McEwitt in just a moment. First thing is, because this is the week of Treaty Day, I wanted to acknowledge the fact that, and we are talking about issues of democracy and issues of determination and issues of sustainability, we should just recognize that we are here in a territory that some will consider an occupied territory. We are here in Mi'kma'ki, and this is the week when we should be honoring the treaties that bind both us and the First Nations peoples one to another. We are all treaty people, as some of our speakers last year reminded us very forcefully. And so on Treaty Day is not an event for the Mi'kmaq community, it's an event for all Nova Scotians to honor our relationships to one another. The second thing I wanted to mention in connection with that is that in the realm of the broad public and the common good, this is the weekend of celebrating the 250th anniversary of the Halifax Common. And the Halifax Common, Friends of the Common, and the organizers of that 250th anniversary festival are part of the organizing group for tonight's event. There's a very big set of events happening over the course of the next few days on the Commons and around the Commons, and for any of you who are interested in those issues, or any of you who are just interested in actually really understanding what it's like to live as part of a democratic society in a community like this, please partake of those, and there's information outside on that. That's by way of a general introduction. If we could make sure that there's a route, so single line if you're in the aisle, please. Just down one side, guys. We got otherwise the fire marshal will shut us down. So it's now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Gordon McEwitt. Gordon is the head of the Situating Science Knowledge Cluster and is the lead partner in presenting our lecture tonight. Gordon.
It's nice to see that the students came to this rather than Dan Savage. I think he's on at the same time, and the older people are not going over to Mozart across the street. I have lots of people to thank, because this is a large set of partners that have pulled together this evening, starting, of course, with the College of Sustainability to encourage us to be part of their Thursday evening lecture series. But we also have to thank the people that are involved in Situating Science, which is a SSHRC-funded strategic knowledge cluster that brings together historians, philosophers, sociologists, political studies of science, and looking at it in its social and philosophical context. This is a project that's been running for about 6 years or so, doing things all across the country. We have a culminating big science and society symposium that will be happening in the nation's capital in October 22nd and 23rd. And if you look up Situating Science here on the website, you can actually participate in the live podcasting of that, live streaming of that, which will go for the 2 days, and send in your questions and watch everybody in action. I have to thank Emily Tector, who is a logistics person behind Situating Science and has made everything run like a well-oiled machine. Other partners that are involved in this project tonight, the Canadian Centre for Ethics in Public Affairs, which has this orange thing behind me, and they run a series of public events and educational workshops on the ideas of bringing ethics into the public sphere. And I suggest you have a look at that. Steve also mentioned that the Friends of the Halifax Common are one of our co-sponsors, and they, of course, are doing a mega bunch of things this weekend, hurricane-free, which means that you will enjoy the sun down on the Commons for 2.5 days. Nova Scotia Institute for Science has supported this. The Dalhousie Philosophy Department, which is also hosting the Atlantic Region Philosophical Association meeting this weekend. And the King's College History of Science and Technology program. How many students in my class is from that? A few of you around. Philip Kitcher has agreed to meet with students from King's, and I'm sure a few Dalhousie could squat if they want, at noon tomorrow at the Senior Common Room at King's, and we'll talk about all kinds of stuff that he's been working on philosophically and maybe about this talk. So noon tomorrow, no food, so tough. Philip Kitcher. Now, we all know Philip Kitcher. You could see from the size of the audience. Philip Kitcher burst upon the scenes in the 1980s as a philosopher of mathematics, but that didn't constrain him. If there's any issue in philosophy, Philip Kitcher has been at the very center of it, whether fighting creationism in his book Abusing Science, or taking on the genetic revolution and the consequences to humankind, or even Joyce, James Joyce and Wagner he's written works on. Philip Kitcher has written the key text which all of us philosophers must engage if we're going to engage in that topic. Lately, he has turned to issues of democracy, of the idea of race, of ethics, and his recent turn to pragmatism, and produced a series of works on exactly those topics. Today, we'll engage two of them, democracy and, well, the future of the world. So I give you Philip Kitcher.
Well, thank you very much, Gordon. I shall try to make this lively. There are many of you out here, and I would like it to be a lively occasion for you. And I look forward, as Steve said at the beginning, to learning from you in the question period. So let me begin in the way that philosophers sometimes begin, with a very old philosopher, Plato. If Plato came back today, he would probably say, "I told you so. I told you you shouldn't have this democracy thing. I told you how people should be governed. What you need are wise and good rulers. And it's a consequence of my theory that if they're genuinely wise, they will also be genuinely good. You people who like democracy think you're going to get freedom. But the freedom you have really isn't worth having if it's compromised by your complete ignorance an inability to think issues through so that you make a total mess of things." Now, Plato was a real elitist. He thought that people differed in their native intelligence. He thought people differed in their capacity for wisdom. I don't think that. But Plato was surely right about one thing, that sometimes people don't know, and sometimes what they don't know can really hurt them. And that's why he insisted on the role of experts in leading political life. Now, what do the experts say about our planet and its mean temperature? I'm sure most of you know this, but I want to build on a shared body of understanding. The experts believe that whatever is done now, it's going to be difficult, if not impossible, to prevent the mean global temperature from rising by 2 degrees Celsius by 2100. Maybe the latest IPCC report is a little bit more optimistic, that we might get away with 1.5, 1.75, but the probabilities are low. And if we do nothing at all, if we show no interest whatsoever in climate change, the likely increase in global mean temperature, and now let's be clear about what that is. It's the average temperature across the Earth's surface, will rise between 3 degrees and 7 degrees Celsius. And I want to put that 7-degree figure in context. The last time the Earth's global mean temperature was 6 degrees hotter than it is, or than it was when these measurements were first indexed, there was no ice anywhere. There were swamps very close to both the poles. The last time the Earth was 6 degrees lower in temperature than it was now, not only this region, but most of the continental United States was under massive ice sheets, as was most of Europe too. So we're talking about very large temperature swings that are possible if we do nothing at all. Now, climate scientists have been working on this problem and trying to communicate it to the general public for 30-plus years. And out of their attempts to measure past temperatures and trace the ways in which the Earth's mean temperature has changed over time, has come this famous graph, the hockey stick. You all know what hockey sticks look like. This is Canada, after all. That term was coined by Michael Mann, a climatologist who suffered for his work in this area. He was sued by the Attorney General of the state of Virginia when he was teaching there. Persecution goes on a lot when climate scientists make these kinds of predictions. And it shows a rapid general uprise in the Earth's mean temperature since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Now, for the experts, it's not only uncontroversial that this is happening, it's also uncontroversial that we're causing it. And the lack of controversy rests on something very simple. There's a fine-grained correlation between greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, concentrations of them over time, and the Earth's mean temperature over time. But correlation, as you all know, isn't causation. On the other hand, we know various mechanisms that produce changes in the Earth's mean temperature. And climatologists systematically investigate those and see whether they can account for that warming. And the greenhouse mechanism, which has been known essentially since the 19th century, the greenhouse mechanism can account for this correlation, and no other known mechanism can. That's why everybody is so convinced about anthropogenic global warming. And then they go on from there to try to estimate the probabilities of the size of the increase over the next century. And if you Google global gamble, you will find this picture, and it's a pair of roulette wheels, and you can play with it. You can see what happens. Roll the dice, spin the roulette wheel, see what you get. And you'll get, if you do it several times, you'll get a series of possibilities for the Earth's future. Now, what does that mean? The most obvious way in which rising temperature translates into things that affect our species, human beings, is in a rise in sea level. And so there are other great sites on the internet where you can play around with looking at what the world will look like if the seas rise by 1 meter, 2 meters, 3 meters, whatever. This is what happens to Miami. And Miami is by no means unique. There are lots and lots of bits of the American coastline that are very vulnerable to inundation. Lots of the coastline of Asia, the Bay of Bengal, for example. Lots of islands like the Maldives, which will go under. And lots of bits of North Africa, for example, Egypt, will be in trouble. So there are lots of places at which rising sea levels will cause problems for human beings, given where we now live. But it's wrong, actually, to focus on mean sea level rise here, or mean temperature rise. Things happen away from the mean. We get storms, we get violent events, and in those violent events, you get much larger fluctuations. So what happens if the temperature rises? Well, a distribution of events gets shifted. The mean goes in that picture over there to your right. You get more hot weather and more record hot weather. And if, as some climate scientists believe, climate change, global warming, is also associated with greater variance, that is, it's as if a hand came down on the top of the bell curve and sort of flattened it a bit, so you got fatter tails, then you get even more extreme events. And if, as they believe, the effect of global warming is to slant the precipitation graph in a counterclockwise direction, you get more heavy precipitation. So you have to think not only about a mean rise of a certain amount, but a greater frequency of extreme stormy events that give you storm surges of greater amplitude around that increased mean. Now, the change in extreme weather events is documented. It's been on the rapid increase over the last 4 decades since this phenomenon kicked in. So this isn't simply a matter of theoretical prediction. It's something, again, that can be seen in the data. But it's also wrong just to concentrate on people who live relatively close to the sea. Things will be bad for them, but that's not the only effect of global warming. There is a reasonably good model of what will happen to San Francisco Bay, and in consequence, what will happen to California's Central Valley. And under some really foreseeable circumstances, that could be inundated with seawater and turn into a salt marsh. There are also reasonably good predictions for what's going to happen in the American Southwest. I should say, for those of you who know something about climate modeling of particular regions around the Earth is, of course, extremely difficult because it's subject to all kinds of factors, many of which are very hard to measure and parameters that are very hard to pin down. But for the American Southwest, many models now predict that we are in for a period of severe drought, and that will come about because the usual sources of irrigating this area, large snowpack in winter that runs off relatively slowly in the spring, will no longer be available. A smaller snowpack melting more quickly with flash floods and then followed by a long period of drought. So there are lots of types of adverse consequences. I feel I'm standing here a bit like Cassandra saying, whoa, whoa, whoa. But I want to take you through the full range of things that make this such a serious problem. First, as I've just alluded, rapid snowpack melt with immediate flooding and later drought. When flooding happens, either coastally or through rapid runoff of snow or through very heavy storms, contamination of water supplies, overflow of sewage facilities, disruptions of agriculture, and things that are very hard to predict, changing patterns of infectious disease transmission as humans and animals enter into new ecological relationships with one another, new opportunities for the evolution of disease vectors, and something I think we can all understand, the forced migration of human populations with social disruption. So you have to imagine the flight of hundreds of thousands, possibly millions of people from areas that have become uninhabitable, people who are clamoring for clean water and who are possibly carrying diseases with them, who come in to another area and start competing for the resources that people in that area have. It's hard to predict in any detail the consequences of that, but the phenomenon is obviously worrying. Now, the trouble is, it's impossible, with respect to some of these things, to have any serious idea about what the chances are. We can make estimates of the chances of various levels of temperature increase. But that doesn't translate directly into exact probabilities of sea level rise because it depends on where that global, or how that global mean temperature is distributed. Some ice sheets will melt, but will they be big ones causing a very large rise, or will they be smaller ones making the rise more manageable? We don't know the likelihood of various extreme weather events. And we certainly don't know the ways in which different areas of the globe will be affected, with some exceptions. North Africa, the Bay of Bengal, and so forth. But there are a lot of potentially disastrous events in this forecast. And even if we can't estimate the probabilities are not zero. So it's unlikely that we'll avoid experiencing a significant number of them. I like here to use an analogy. Suppose that you foresaw, this seems unlikely in Halifax in Nova Scotia, but suppose that you foresaw that the town in which you live would, in the relatively near future, be pitched into a multi-sided civil war, like the civil war that's raging in Syria, only possibly worse, with more factions involved. You might think that it would be a good policy to get yourself and your family out, go somewhere else before it's too late. But you can't predict what will happen if you stay. You'll go out, if you stay, day after day, trying to find food and water and all the other necessities of life. And from time to time, round particular corners will come militias who are ready to gun people down at the drop of a hat. Will it be you? You can't predict. But if the dangers are sufficiently many, then you'd be very unwise to stay. Because even if those dangers have pretty small probabilities, there are a lot of them. And your chances of avoiding all of them are very small indeed. That, I think, is a good analogy for our situation with respect to climate change. Now, I'm going to come back at this point to democracy and the conditions of the public debate. Suppose that tomorrow the world got up and in every nation around the globe, people agreed that the minimal view about global warming, that consensus view among climate scientists, were correct. That would be a great step forward. But even if that happened, it would be very hard to solve this problem because we don't know the exact risks. And as many economists have reminded us over the last 20 years, there are economic costs associated with policies that limit the emissions of greenhouse gases. How do you give up the dependence on fossil fuels without crashing the economy? And if you crash the economy, you contribute to another kind of harm that people in future generations will suffer. We might think you can do something to jigger the climate. You can go in for geoengineering, inject something into the atmosphere that lessens the greenhouse effect. Well, our efforts to do that sort of thing in the past have not been very promising. introducing rabbits into Australia, and then the myxoma virus to get rid of the overpopulation of rabbits, spraying DDT all over the place. And finally, different countries face different costs. Countries that are on the verge of real economic development now reasonably look at the polluting giants of the past, like the United States, and say, well, you've had your turn, you've created this mess. Why should we pay the cost of that? But in fact, we don't even live in that kind of world, because all around us there are people who are invested in denying climate change or denying that it poses any serious risk. So in the United States, and increasingly worldwide, we can't even get the simple issue right. This comes about as in a terrific book that I urge any of you who are interested in the way in which these debates are funded and organized. This terrific book, Merchants of Doubt, by Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway. Okay. So there's a whole apparatus, well-funded apparatus, that is in the business of making sure that the voices of the deniers get heard. And so, instead of the sorts of charts and graphs that climatologists show, the hockey stick, these other two charts, which are from work by James Hansen, the man who originally testified to Congress saying that global warming is real in 1988, 25 years ago. Instead of these things, you see different kinds of graphs. And if you surf the net and look for things like climate denial or hide the decline, that's a particularly good one, you find rival graphs, rival accounts of how the Earth's temperature is changing. And you find pundits in the United Kingdom, like Christopher Booker, saying things like, this is the worst scientific scandal of our generation. In this context, the public doesn't know what to believe. In fact, at the moment, according to the Pew Research Center, which is a very good source for getting figures on this, 69% of Americans understand that global warming is happening. Now, this is very interesting because there's a series of reactions by the public. The public was pretty sensitive to climate change around about 2006-07, went through a real decline in 2009, 2010, and is now about halfway back to where it was in 2006, 2007. Only 42% of Americans take the warming to be caused by human activities. 33% of Americans take global warming to be a very serious problem. That's down from 45% in 2007. But in fact, the percentage of Americans who think that global warming is either very serious or somewhat serious has stayed for quite a while now around 65%. The shift is between those who think it's very serious, that was relatively high in 2007, and those who think it's somewhat serious. In the UK, it's about the same. 43% of people think the Earth is getting warmer as a result of human activity, as opposed to 42% in the United States. Now, you might think in Australia, where they've had recent outbreaks of really severe fires, there might be more sensitivity. 43% think the Earth is getting warmer because of human activity. 46.5% think humans make a significant contribution to warming. Canada, the figures I got, and these are controversial because trouble is Canadians and Australians and Britons and Americans ask slightly different questions of their populations, which makes comparing these responses hard. But on paper, Canada looks rather better. 57% think that science shows conclusively that humans cause global warming. A more recent study disaggregated that question and said, and asked, do you think it's just caused by humans? That was a much smaller number. Do you think it's partly caused by humans? That was roughly the same number, adding up to 55%. So as you can see, there aren't enough people seriously worried about this to start a groundswell for action in the major English-speaking democracies. Now, let's go back to Plato's charge. Plato wouldn't have counted what Canada has or what the United Kingdom has or what the United States has as a democracy. He thought in terms of high-born men going and voting directly on issues of concern to them. But we have a popular image of democracy, and it goes like this. Democracies are good because policies that affect all should be decided in accordance with the will of the people. So what you should do is you should canvass the will of the people, either through a referendum or through having them vote for representatives. And the people should know about what goes on with these issues, and so they should be freely debated in public. This is, I think, the image that people have of democracy, and when they talk about spreading democracy into other parts of the world, this is the sort of thing I think they have in mind. Now, if you honor those thoughts, it seems overwhelmingly likely that in the next year or two, unless there's a serious change, no policies, no serious policies to govern the emission of greenhouse gases will be instituted, except maybe in Canada. You're probably much better judges of that than I am. Now, is that something that enhances the freedom of the people? Well, think for a moment about what it means to enhance your freedom. For your freedom to be enhanced is for you to get what you want, and not what you want momentarily, as you might suddenly feel the urge to drink a beer, or go for a run, or not study this evening, or whatever. But what you would reflectively want, if you thought about the options in terms of your life as a whole. And if you think about it that way, it seems to me very difficult to get away from the idea that the future matters. If, quite quickly, our planet becomes a very difficult place for human beings to live in the ways that we have enjoyed living, then that really casts a shadow over what we do and the value of what we do. And if we make a contribution to the relatively short-run extinction of the human species, that seems to me really to undermine the value of the things we do. I think that because I think our lives matter, and they matter because they matter to other people, and they matter because we're parts of an ongoing human enterprise in which we contribute to the next generation and the generation after that. And that's why I think that part of our freedom consists in wanting to live lives that will have been worthwhile because they will have mattered. And that means that we care about our grandchildren, and not just about the people in that generation who are related to us, but others too. We want it to be the case that those people will have benefited from our efforts, will have built on what we've accomplished, and will be able themselves to live important, valuable lives that will bear on the lives of their descendants. So I think the well-being of the future is integral to whatever way in which you think about your life project. Your life has a significance in virtue of the ways in which it affects others and the way in which it leaves repercussions in later lives. And if what you do, if what we collectively do, turns out to undermine that, it undermines the significance of our lives and thereby undermines our freedom. What's in our interests is actually preserving the planet for our successors. That's a claim I make. I've tried to motivate it. I haven't really given you a serious argument for it, but you might reflect on it. So I don't think the existing state of democracy is enhancing human freedom. I invite you to think about democracy in this way. We have ideals of freedom and equality for ourselves and for our society that should be promoted by the involvement of the citizens in decisions about matters that affect them. And that should be realized in an institutional machinery of elections and votes and the law. That's, I think, the way democracy is supposed to work. But it doesn't necessarily work that way. Things can go wrong if the standard machinery of elections, votes, and the law stops being linked in the right way to the fundamental freedoms that we want to get realized. Now, democracies have histories. And democracy is actually, as we know it, the outgrowth of a series of responses, I think, to an enduring political problem. It's the problem of being oppressed. And democracies basically emerge as people in various countries fight their way out of a state of oppression. And historically, the problem is, I'll call the problem of identifiable oppression. There's a tyrant, a tyrannical ruler. You know who he is, you know what he does, and you know how it affects you and your friends. And so, you look to some measure of control over your rulers, popular control. And out of that comes democracy. Constitutions and elections offer safeguards. And the safeguards can break down, as they did in Nazi Germany. Democracy is constantly vulnerable and constantly fragile. But it's a really good thing. It's a really good response to what has historically been an extraordinarily important problem. But our problem is more insidious than that. It's the problem that I call the problem of unidentifiable oppression. That's a problem that comes for the kids who go to the school on the top right. They don't know why the circumstances in which they're supposed to learn are so wretched. But the machinery of their government has failed to provide for them. And they don't see where that failure comes from. And similarly, for us who breathe the air at the bottom left, something is going wrong that's inhibiting action in various ways. But we can't trace it to its source. We can't see the cause of what's happening. And so when we vote in elections, we vote blindly, and we don't really realize our freedom. Now, classical theorists of democracy have thought that there was a solution to all of this. They have thought that the public is in the best position to know its own interests because if the issues are debated freely in front of the public, then the public will come to know what it really wants, what it's really interested in. The truth will out, as Milton puts it. And though all the winds of doctrine were let loose to play upon the earth, so truth be in the field, we do injuriously by licensing and prohibiting to misdoubt her strength. Let her and falsehood grapple, whoever knew truth put to the worse, in a free and open encounter. Remember those words, in a free and open encounter. 2 centuries later, John Stuart Mill, who co-wrote, he said, On Liberty with Harriet Taylor, thought that free and open debate would produce a greater apprehension of the truth. that it would produce a more vivid impression of what was true, and it would enable the public to decide on the basis of evidence. That has not happened in the climate change debate. Mill and Milton assumed that public discussion of the issues with which they were concerned, primarily religious freedom issues, would lead to a situation in which people could actually appreciate the force of the evidence. They would see which conclusion was well supported and which conclusion was poorly supported. But in the climate change debate, that has gone awry. And it's gone awry because there are powerful interests that can buy time at the microphone and that can say the same things again and again and again and shrug off refutations because the evidence behind the refutations is very hard to explain clearly to the general public. And so those dismal figures that I showed you earlier represent a confused public, a public that has seen perhaps many instances of public debate about these issues, but ends up in a state of misinformation and confusion. So we should stop pretending, I think. The ideal of free discussion is an immensely important one. But we should not think that in the contemporary world and in contemporary media, that's what we've got. The public rhetoric is, let's have more discussion about this. But the discussions that we have don't take into account the evidence and the presentations of the evidence in a way that transmits those transparently to the citizenry. Public debate isn't doing what it's supposed to do. Freedom of inquiry is a good. And what we need to do, the first thing we need to do to restore the health of democracy is to put in place conditions that might make it a value that can be taken for granted. So how do you do that? If we're to get as far as a serious discussion of the difficult issues, the pretense of climate denial has to be ended, I think. We have to learn once again to trust the experts, to have a public that agrees that when the IPCC reports something, that's the best knowledge we can get. Now, educating a new generation of citizens is going to be far too slow. The atmosphere doesn't wait. It just keeps absorbing more carbon dioxide, and if we're really unlucky, a whole lot of methane too. So how do we restore trust in sciences? Well, there are ways of doing that. One way is to have the scientists come out and speak again and again and again, trying to be as clear as possible and trying to contribute under the existing conditions of public debate. Another is for some citizens to go inside and come back and report to the rest. For us to break down the barrier that separates the expert community from the people who vote. I think we need one or both of these mechanisms, and we need them urgently. But there's something more that's at work here, and that is behind the view that if we've got a debate that goes on, and the citizens are still not convinced, then what we need to do is have the scientists go away and work even harder so they can tell us with even more clear and demonstrable evidence that their conclusions are correct. But that's just a fantasy. Climate science has already done, it seems to me, as much as could possibly or needs to be done with respect to the minimal claim. But when we look at the harder issues and start to think about which regions of the globe will be affected in which ways, there's no serious possibility that we're going to get the kind of demonstrable evidence for particular predictions about who's going to be affected and when. That's a fantasy. There are so many numbers of uncertainties that are going to affect the effects of global warming. For example, we can't predict what will happen if, as seems very likely, large groups of people are periodically going to be forced to migrate, or when, possibly with outbreaks of epidemics among them, they can't get access to clean water. We can just know in a vague way that it's bad. We can't tell where it's going to happen, and we can't tell how likely it is. But if you accept my analogy about the Civil War, we ought to be doing something about it, and we ought to be doing something about it quickly. On the other hand, economics is even more uncertain. Predicting the state of the future global economy, if certain kinds of policies to limit greenhouse gases are put in place, is also extraordinarily vulnerable to the details of the assumptions that are made. Economists are just not very good at making large-scale predictions of this kind. So there is going to be a lot of guesswork involved. We should rely on the experts to tell us what they know. We should rely on them to give us an account of the possibilities, but we shouldn't, under any circumstances, delay crafting policy until they can give us precise probabilities for particular catastrophes at particular places in the future, because that day is never going to come. But we're used to this. We're all used to this. As you think about your own future, as you think about the future of your family, you know that there are all sorts of things that you can't predict in any detail. And so you try to make a rough budget, and you adjust as you go. You try to prepare for certain kinds of risks that might happen or might not, that you can foresee. You try to appreciate the relative scale of those risks, and you go forward, constantly attuned to the information you're getting about how things are going. I think that model is something that needs to come into play when we think about climatology and the future of the planet as a place for human beings to live. We're always going to be weighing uncertain estimates against one another. The costs of intervening, the human costs of making a policy, because there will be costs of various kinds of climate policies, against the costs of just letting the planet heat up. Now, I'm going to close by suggesting to you that there's a higher form of democracy that really needs to come into play at this point. And it's grounded in an ethical stance to which I'm committed. In some of my other work, I'm inclined to trace the origins of our ethical life, the ways in which we give one another recommendations for what to do, make demands on people, set down rules and structures for our lives together, as growing out of a very primitive practice in which our Paleolithic ancestors engaged. How to run life in a small group together. That's, it seems to me, where ethical life began. But today, we've learned how to deal with larger groups. We've learned how to deal with ethical life in villages and towns and states and nations. But now we are required to do something on an even broader scale because of the interconnection of our activities that causes potentially a whole series of problems for all of us, or for some of us, and we don't know which ones. So today, the effective group that requires working out its shared ethical life together is the human species, including our descendants. In this situation, it seems to me that we need a cosmopolitan approach in which we come together as a species to take steps, and like the family, adjusting what we do as new signals come in. There's a terrible tendency in much thinking about climate change to think of a policy as if it was something you signed on to once and for all, as if you were condemned to go down a particular railway track forever. But that's not our situation. We have a problem as a species, and we can start out in a particular direction, and we can see what's happening, and then we can either scale up our efforts or scale back and try to avoid the consequences of some of our policies if they turn out to be damaging. At the end of one of the greatest papers written by an American philosopher, William James borrows an image from a British writer, Stephen. He says, imagine yourself on a mountain pass in a blizzard. The snow is coming down, you can hardly see in any direction. If you stay put, you will be frozen for sure. What are you going to do? You don't know which way is a path down. You know there are precipices all around you. So what do? James says, you strike out in some direction or another and commit yourself to it. But that's not quite the way you do it if you were on the mountain pass. What you do if you were on the mountain pass is you would strike out in a direction, but you would be very attentive to the signals you were getting along the way. You would look to see if all of a sudden the ground was falling away rather sharply. You would look to see if there was a possibility of a gentler slope somewhere else. That, it seems to me, is what policy making is all about. You can make policy in situations of uncertainty, and we do make policy in situations of uncertainty, and we do it by committing ourselves to an initial direction, but also to the possibility of changing direction if things go wrong. And so I suggest that's the way Homo sapiens should go. Cosmopolitan, attuned to all, attentive, and pragmatic. And so to conclude, can we sustain democracy and the planet too? Yeah. We better. First, we better make sure that our existing democracies are doing the kinds of things democracies are supposed to do. Restoring the conditions under which the ways people vote really do express their interests and contribute to their freedoms. Restoring trust in the experts and getting started on the project of climate change. But beyond that, we need global democracy. We need serious enterprises in which the people of the world join together, in which we won't tolerate anymore the kind of bargaining that is based on the idea that it's okay for some nations to lose completely. It has to be a more cooperative effort than that. I say this with some irony, since I have flown here from a country in which cooperative bargaining seems to have broken down completely. And so what we need on a global scale is something like what the IPCC does when it issues its reports. We need to gather evidence. We need to appraise that evidence thoroughly, rigorously, and honestly. We need to engage with one another and with the needs of all people and work out a democratic framework that will ensure a future for our descendants. Thank you very much.
Philip. So we have a good amount of time for questions. I'll also let you know before we start the questions that there is actually a reception outside in the upper part of the lobby afterwards. So the benefit of staying around for questions is the snacks afterwards. The issues that Philip has outlined are ones that will be with some of us in the room for a certain amount of time, and for others of us in the room for a much longer period of their lives. So I'm going to open the floor to questions first from students in the room. If you have questions, a brief question you want to ask, just put your hand up and we'll go from there.
Right
yes,
at the back.
Green shirt. So the comment is about issues of global trade in relationship to environmental degradation. How do we promote global democracy?
That's a very, very good question. So I think what we have to do is find ways of making it possible for resources to be transferred to places at the moment that are unable to develop themselves, so that we can try to make, insofar as it's possible, things locally self-sustaining. But we also need to just simply find better ways of getting goods and services around the world, right? I mean, that's really a serious problem. I mean, if you really are going to try to take care of people in distant places, then you've got to ship a lot of stuff there. I mean, even if you had the agreement of wealthier nations to do things on behalf of poor nations, you'd still need all kinds of transportation services. Now, certainly there are things that you can do that currently we indulge ourselves tremendously and unnecessarily in certain kinds of ways. I'm an avid cook. I really like to cook. And I feel extremely guilty about the fact that basically I buy what ingredients I want to cook with at whatever time of the year I want to, okay? And I know that's unnecessary, and I shouldn't do it. There are things that obviously we can cut out, but the fundamental problem is a real one. And the outline or the schema of my solution to it would be to try to invest early in shifting resources in such a way that one can make local communities relatively self-sufficient. That's not going to be, when I say relatively, I mean relatively, because obviously there are going to be some kinds of things that communities need that they can't provide for themselves. But I think we can cut down the extent to which things need to be imported.
Okay, so go right to the back. So the question is really, is a move away from capitalism a necessary first step towards the global democracy you talk about?
Okay, I think that's, again, a really good question. I'm going to give you a qualified answer to this. It seems to me there are some things that markets can do. Proponents of markets tend to exaggerate what they can do. Proponents of markets also tend to forget that the father of their ideology, namely Adam Smith, wrote a large chunk of The Wealth of Nations about the preconditions that are needed for markets to function properly. That tends to get dropped out in the celebrations of capitalism. But it may well be that capitalism has to be integrated with a different set of economic institutions, institutions that foster collaboration and cooperation. So it may be that there's going to have to be a delineation between what one might call spheres of market competition and spheres of collaboration and cooperation. So to that extent, that would be a departure from the kind of capitalism we have. I want to make a more general theoretical point. Capitalism is the system that economists spend a lot of their lives trying to understand, and what they do is they introduce various kinds of proxies for the values of outcomes, and those are usually given in terms of monetary values. That's infected the climate change debate, where many of the options that are seen are ranked in monetary terms. That seems to me an utter mistake. the real consequences of this should be measured in terms of humans and human lives and human well-being. And I'd like to see economics return to a different kind of theoretical framework in which we practiced it with a kind of ethical backdrop to it. Arguably, that was the case with respect to the pioneers of economic theory in the 18th and 19th centuries. And I think we need to return to that. Look, I think there's no doubt whatsoever that any possible sustainable solution to the climate change problem is going to require certain kinds of voluntary transfers from the rich nations of the world to the poorer nations of the world. I don't see any way of getting around that. There are economists who write about the ways in which the bargaining over how you limit your emissions should go, as if it was sort of taken for granted that at the end of the day, when we've solved the problem of global warming, rampant economic competition among nations was going to go forward on roughly the same terms that now exist. That seems to me an impossible idea. I mean, it seems to me to be completely at odds with any principles of justice. And so you can't expect, it seems to me, developing nations to buy into a scheme which at the end of, supposing there is a solution to the problem of global warming, which at the end leaves them in exactly the same relative position they were at the beginning. I think we have to basically pursue this in a much more egalitarian way. And that probably does, as your initial question suggested, mean a departure from capitalism as it has currently been developed. And the point of my first answer to you was to recognize that to amend capitalism in that way is not to give up the idea that a market and competition are sometimes good for doing certain kinds of things.
Okay. I'm going to go over here. Yeah. So
All right.
Part A. This is the last two-part question, okay?
All right.
Part A is a challenge. Really, it's not a question, but a challenge to the plausibility.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hobbs. I will come to the second part of your question later on.
Based on the challenge of human nature and the argumentativeness of humans.
All right. So you wouldn't be here today in this kind of place, and I wouldn't be here today in this kind of place unless humans in certain groups at certain times had figured out ways of coming to agreement with one another. And you know very well from your own example of going to a movie together. So you have friends, you're probably sitting among them, and you might disagree initially about what movie you want to go to see. And if it's more important for you to see the movies of your choice than to go to the movies together, then you'll go your separate ways. But if it's more important for you to go together to a movie, then you'll figure it out. That's what families do, that's what small groups of hunter-gatherers do, and that's what our ancestors did, and that's what produced the kinds of cooperative possibilities that distinguish us as a species, okay? Now, the real challenge has always been at the moments when it had to be scaled up. How did you get the local group to stop treating the guys across the river as completely hostile? Well, they had to come and see that there was something they needed that required the extension of the kinds of procedures that they'd already worked through for reaching agreement among themselves to making agreement between groups. And one force of the terrible consequences that may occur from climate change is it may bring us to see that we actually need to extend the kinds of ways we have of working things out more broadly. Now, I'm not as optimistic as I sound. I mean, I wouldn't want to place bets on this, but we have done it in the past, and I would like to think we could do it this time too.
Okay, so I'm going to actually ask you to sit because I got a lot more questions. So I'm going to go to the back. there. So I do need to repeat the question for our viewers at home, the thousands who are watching. But the gist of the question is, you propose an evidence-based democratic deliberative process, and we face governments in Canada and elsewhere that are actually quite intent on removing access to evidence, removing evidence altogether, removing inconvenient information from the policy decision framework.
If I knew the answer to the question about Canada, I would have tried to spread it in the United States, which got dysfunctional earlier. I mean, we've been dysfunctional longer. You may be feeling a lot of disappointment because for a long time you clearly had what seemed to be a healthier political life in this country. And now it's going in the wrong direction. Well, look, there are various ways of trying to do this. One is to try to try to get a political party behind restoring democracy. Another is to have some sorts of local groups that start as the Occupy movements did, as the Move On movement in the United States did. Start trying to push the political life in a different direction. But perhaps at the end of the day, all of this will come together around the climate change issue in some very large catastrophe. The real trouble is, of course, that by the time the catastrophes start showing up, this is one of the things about the climate change debate that makes, or the climate change issue that makes it so special and so troubling, so difficult. By the time the catastrophes start to show up, the damage has already been done. The stuff is in the atmosphere. It's on its way to equilibrium, and it's just going to stay there for a while, and you're going to get a lot more of it. But look, this is the question that has bedeviled people like James Hansen for the last 25 years. And it's clear that he hasn't solved it by testifying as an expert and shouting at the world that they've got to sit up and listen. I really don't know. I mean, this is the problem of the disintegration of democracy in the nations that pride themselves on democratic government is real. And that was really the theme of my talk about democracy. There's a lot of work to be done right here and now to get real democracy back. And the first thing I think needs to be done is for lots of people who think about democracy to say, no, this is pretense. Actually, what we do is we live in statistical oligarchies. Let me explain that. An oligarchy is a group, is ruled by a few. Now, a statistical oligarchy is one in which the few just inject lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of money in the political process, knowing that that gives them a very high probability of getting in candidates who will do the things that they want. That's why it's a statistical oligarchy. And sometimes things go wrong, and you get a black community organizer as president of the United States. And then what do? Well, you just try to limit the damage, and you can see what's happening. I wish I knew. I wish I knew how to solve the problem of undermining this kind of move in our politics, this move away from genuine democracy. But I think the only thing I can do is keep saying, the emperor has no clothes, the democracy has no meaning, and start there.
Okay. Now, I'm also willing to take questions at this point from the older generation, if they have any. But so actually, I'll go with Ian here. So, in a nutshell, if we
If democracy is broken down locally, what hope is there for the global?
How do we make it global?
Well, look, you're absolutely right. I mean, the last question was extremely eloquent on this, it seems to me. But look at the consequences. Look at the consequences for the global demos, if I can call it that, right? That's, again, slightly oxymoronic. But the trouble here is that we are one people, one group of agents with respect to the planet, because we are all intricately involved in affecting the atmosphere, and we're all completely dependent on the atmosphere and the environment of the planet. Some of us are more vulnerable, but none of us can just say, I and those I care about will be able to ride this out. You see, I think the stakes here are high enough that you can start to get people's attention. That's why I said to the last question, maybe it's the catastrophe that will do it, you know, the big catastrophe. But unless we can do this, it seems to me that the problem is hopeless. You can't work out a solution to this problem without getting people all over the world together to buy into it. I mean, there's a lot of talk about, you know, if America led the way, right? But that's not it. You've got to get everybody on board on this, and you've got to get everybody on board in an arrangement that they feel that they can all accept. That was the point of this really good question about giving up on capitalism. Things have to be amended for that to happen. You cannot say, well, you know, I want you to come on board on this project, and when it's all over, don't look to me for help. We're going to be back to our sort of dog-eat-dog market behavior, and I'm going to try to screw as much money out of you as I can. Those attitudes really are irreconcilable, I think. But so, I mean, in part I'm saying we better do it. In part I'm saying it's because I think at the municipal level sometimes the dangers and the costs look small. At the global level, they're really big, and sooner or later, we'll learn that we have to face them.
Okay. So if education takes too long, how do we get the public educated enough to act and to engage?
It's already being done. There have already been pioneer projects and studies and experiments in getting local groups of people together with scientists on various environmental issues and educating them about them. And there have been some quite striking results from some of these. It doesn't always work, but the idea so there are sort of three possibilities for getting the public on the same page as the scientists. You educate the students of the future better. Well, then you have to wait 20 years or so. You have the scientists spend a significant part of their time in works of advocacy. That doesn't work in the current political climate because those scientists who do that then get branded. You're stepping outside the proper role of the scientist. You're serving as a political figure, Mr. Hansen, Mr. Oppenheimer, Mr. Schneider, whoever, you know, Professor Mann, you know. I mean, so that strategy seems to be defective. The other one, which is being used with respect to some issues, is public involvement in science. Citizens groups that go in and listen and you know, and have the opportunity to listen to varied points of view too, and then come back and can sort of certify. Now, there's a danger to this too, because when they come back, they can be portrayed as being contaminated, right? You went in, you got brainwashed, you come out again, and that's a danger. But something needs to be done to get us over the hump, even to start. I mean, most of the other questions have been worried about, you know, how we solve the really big problem of getting a global policy on this. But your question is, you know, how do we even get going in the first place? And that already is hard. What a wonderful idea.
What about the role of the media? Yes.
So what has happened to the media? You can tell me what's happened to Canadian media. And what's happened to the media in the United States is that it's gone from being a vehicle for presenting information to being a vehicle that claims market share. How do you claim market share? Well, you claim market share by amusing, by having attractive people read the news, and also by telling people what they want to know. So if I really don't like the idea that I'm going to have to give up driving my SUV, let me tune in to a certain channel, and you can guess which one it is, or go to a particular website, and then I will be happy. I will be told things that sit comfortably with my worldview. And conversely, if I have a different worldview, I can go and read the Huffington Post or Slate or watch MSNBC, read the New York Times, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so what we've got is sort of media niches. It's a little bit of niche diversification that's gone on in the media. How do you get that back? Well, you might say, well, you could have CNBC. The trouble is, if you start introducing an independent, state-funded, non-profit medium that's going to do serious journalism in this context, you've got sufficiently powerful political forces out there and sufficiently powerful money out there to say, this isn't the old BBC. I grew up with the old BBC, eminently trustworthy, or CBC, which I take it is pretty trustworthy. You can correct me if I'm wrong about that. Sorry?
There's a lot of skepticism about this.
There's a lot of skepticism. Okay, leave CBC out of it. No, the people who want to debunk this have a very simple line. You know, this is Orwell's organs. It's Pravda. It's the government line. You can see this in remarks of the kind that Sarah Palin used to love to make about the lamestream media. I'm not sure how you get the media back. I mean, one thing to do is to say, let's stop, let's pull capitalism out of this completely. Let's have tremendous regulation, and any media source that violates certain kinds of normative principles will be incredibly fined and punished. I don't know, might work, but the media has failed in this. And they've failed by doing something that sounds so innocuous. They've failed by taking the view that if there are people who want to speak on a given issue who deny what a large community of scientists, you must give them equal time. And that's been a terrible regressive step, and it's responsible for a lot of the misinformation that's floating about.
So we're coming towards the end. I'm going to toss a little modest proposal out for you as one maybe hypothetical solution to the problem of global democracy. If we were to imagine changing the franchise and say that, in fact, active participation in government must cease by the age of 45, do you think we'd get different results? That would put me out, but, you know.
Yeah. Well, of course, you wouldn't even have finished Plato's ideal course of education by the time you're 45, since Plato thinks it takes 50 years. I don't know. You might get different results. I mean, it seems to me that the young have been extraordinary in certain kinds of social changes. Look, here's a bit of good news. Think about the ways in which attitudes towards same-sex relations has changed. You know, many of you are too young to have seen this over a long time period, but in fact, it's been extraordinary in my lifetime. Absolutely extraordinary, the way in which this is altered. And now it's completely, it seems to me, I mean, the young people I know, maybe you won't agree with this, but it seems to me that this is just a non-issue for young people. It's just a non-issue. They wonder what all the fuss is about. And that's wonderful. That really is wonderful. So So maybe we should invest in the young and let them, let them make the decisions for us.
Get out of the way. For those of you who are interested in pursuing further thoughts on ethics with Philip, he will be doing a talk, Rethinking Ethics, tomorrow as part of the Atlantic Region Philosophers Association conference and meeting. That's tomorrow at 6 p.m. in Scotiabank Auditorium across the hall. There are snacks and goodies outside, but please join me in thanking Philip Kitcher for this very inspiring talk.